Heavy fog does not look dangerous, that's what makes it deadly. There are no violent clouds, no lightning, no obvious warning that something catastrophic is about to unfold. Just white space. On the day of the medical flight operated by the Mexican Navy near Galveston, conditions did not scream, "Do not fly." They whispered something far more dangerous, "Proceed carefully." And in aviation, that whisper has ended more flights than storms ever have. This was not a combat mission. It was not a training exercise. It was a medical flight, the kind of flight where urgency quietly competes with safety, and every minute feels like it matters. What happened next was not the result of one bad decision. It was the result of fog changing the rules of reality without anyone fully realizing it in time. When people hear fog, they imagine inconvenience, delays, low visibility, something pilots deal with all the time. And that's true, fog is common. But heavy fog is different. It doesn't just block vision. It rewrites perception. Fog removes depth. It removes contrast. It removes reference points. And when reference points disappear, the human brain fills in the gaps with assumptions. That's where the story begins. The flight approached the Galveston area under conditions that were deteriorating, but not dramatically. No alarms. No sudden weather wall. Just visibility slowly dropping below the point where the outside world could be trusted. In those moments, pilots transition from visual flying to instrument flying. That transition sounds technical, but psychologically, it's massive. It requires the pilot to stop trusting instinct and start trusting data alone. And that switch is harder than people think. Here's the first hard truth about fog-related crashes. They don't happen because pilots can't fly in fog. They happen because fog arrives faster than the brain fully adapts. In this case, the aircraft was still flyable. Systems were functioning, the crew was trained, nothing had failed in the way people expect accidents to begin. Instead, the environment quietly removed margin. Fog reduces situational awareness in three ways at once. Visual cues disappear, depth perception collapses, time feels compressed. What feels like level flight can be a descent. What feels like clearance can be terrain. What feels stable can already be unrecoverable. That's why fog is so unforgiving during approach and landing, the exact phase this flight was in. A medical mission adds another invisible pressure, urgency without panic. No one is reckless. No one is rushing blindly. But there is an unspoken weight, the knowledge that turning back or delaying has consequences beyond the aircraft. That pressure doesn't cause bad decisions. It narrows options. And fog thrives in narrow options. Investigators later focused heavily on one question. When did the fog stop being manageable and start being decisive? Because there is always a moment when conditions cross a line. Not dramatically, quietly. 1 second the environment supports recovery. The next second it doesn't. In fog, that line is nearly invisible. Another dangerous aspect of heavy fog is false familiarity. The area around Galveston is well known. Coastal terrain. Flat profiles. Water nearby. These environments trick the brain into believing terrain risk is low. But fog doesn't care about familiarity. When visual references vanish, even flat terrain becomes lethal, especially when altitude perception is lost. One of the most disturbing aspects of this crash is that there was no indication of panic, no chaotic maneuvering, no sudden aggressive correction. Everything points to a crew that believed they were still within safe parameters right up until they weren't. That's the paradox of fog accidents. The aircraft doesn't feel out of control. The crew doesn't feel overwhelmed. The danger doesn't feel urgent until it is irreversible. This is why investigators often say fog-related crashes are not weather accidents in the traditional sense. The weather doesn't overpower the aircraft. It misleads the human mind. And once the mind is misled, physics takes over. In the next part, we'll break down how heavy fog disrupts pilot perception, why instrument trust breaks down under stress, and how a perfectly flyable aircraft can descend into catastrophe without a single system failing. Because the most dangerous thing about fog isn't that you can't see. It's that you think you still can. That heavy fog doesn't attack the aircraft. It attacks the pilot's senses. That distinction is critical. In clear weather, flying is a partnership between sight, balance, and instruments. Your eyes confirm what your body feels. Your body confirms what the instruments show. When all three agree, situational awareness feels effortless. Fog destroys that agreement. The first thing fog takes away is depth perception. Objects don't get gradually closer, they appear suddenly or not at all. Distance becomes guesswork. Height above the ground becomes a feeling instead of a measurement. The brain hates that uncertainty. So, it does what it always does under sensory loss. It fills in the gaps. That's where danger begins. In fog, pilots must transition fully to instruments. Not partially. Not mostly. Fully. And that transition has to be immediate and absolute. Any hesitation, any moment of trying to peek outside for confirmation creates conflict between instinct and data. That conflict is called sensory mismatch, and it is one of the most lethal states in aviation. Your inner ear might say you're level. Your eyes see nothing. Your instruments say you're descending. Which one do you believe? Under calm conditions, the answer is obvious. Instruments. Under stress, urgency, and fatigue, that clarity can fracture briefly, subtly, but fatally. Another problem fog creates is time compression. When visibility drops, pilots lose the ability to visually anticipate. In clear air, you see what's coming. In fog, you only see what's already too close. That means decisions must be made faster with less information. Approach paths that feel long in clear weather suddenly feel rushed. Corrections that would normally be gentle now need to be precise and immediate. There is no visual buffer. Fog also removes contrast. The horizon disappears. Water, land, and sky blend together. Over coastal areas like Galveston, this is especially dangerous. The surface offers almost no visual texture, which makes altitude judgment nearly impossible without strict instrument discipline. This is where a subtle but critical error often occurs: overconfidence in familiarity. Pilots who know an area well may unconsciously rely on memory instead of instruments. They know where the shoreline is. They know where obstacles usually are. They believe they're higher than they are because they've flown this approach many times before. Fog punishes that belief. In heavy fog, familiar terrain becomes irrelevant. The environment is effectively new, even if the map is old. Another psychological factor is mission pressure. This was a medical flight. That matters. Medical flights carry a quiet urgency. Not reckless urgency, but meaningful urgency. The knowledge that someone needs help can make delays feel costly. That doesn't mean pilots ignore procedures. It means their tolerance for interruption narrows under fog conditions. This can subtly shift decision-making from optimized safety to maintain continuity. That shift is not a mistake. It's human. But fog amplifies its consequences. As visibility drops, pilots often believe they can stabilize first and reassess in a moment. That's reasonable until fog eliminates the moment. Another major factor is instrument fixation. When external references disappear, pilots may focus too narrowly on one instrument altitude. For example, while missing another critical parameter like vertical speed or airspeed. This tunnel vision is not negligence, it's cognitive overload. Heavy fog increases workload dramatically. More instrument scanning, more precise control, more mental effort. Day-oriented as workload rises, the brain simplifies. It prioritizes what feels most important and deprioritizes the rest. That's how a stable descent can quietly become an unstable descent. Fog-related accidents often involve what investigators call controlled flight into terrain. The aircraft is under control. The pilot believes the path is safe. The systems are functioning. The descent is smooth until the ground arrives. The most terrifying part is that nothing feels wrong until the last seconds. No alarms, no sudden failure. Just a mismatch between belief and reality. And once that mismatch becomes obvious, there is often no time left to correct it. This is why fog is especially dangerous near the end of a flight. Altitude margins are already small. Speed margins are tighter. Workload is highest. There is no room for delayed recognition. In this case, the evidence points not to panic, but to gradual misperception. A belief that the aircraft was where it should be. A belief that the approach was still stable. A belief that visibility, though poor, was manageable. Fog thrives on beliefs like that. In the next part, we'll examine the final moments how descent profiles collapse in heavy fog, why recovery becomes impossible in seconds, and how a perfectly flightable aircraft can be lost without any system ever failing. Because the most dangerous thing about fog isn't that it hides the ground, it's that it convinces you the ground is still farther away than it really is. The final minutes of this flight did not unfold with chaos. They unfolded with normality, and that's what makes them so dangerous. In heavy fog, the most lethal accidents are not violent. They are quietly precise. The aircraft is configured for approach. Power settings are reasonable. Descent rates appear controlled. The crew believes they are where they should be. But fog has already removed the most important safety net, external confirmation. As the aircraft descended, the crew was relying almost entirely on instruments. That is standard. That is trained. But instrument flying during approach is not just about reading numbers, it's about constant cross-checking. Altitude, vertical speed, airspeed, glide path. Miss one trend for a few seconds, and the margin disappears. This is where fog compresses time. A descent rate that is only slightly high becomes dangerous when there is no visual cue to warn you early. A momentary distraction adjusting power, checking navigation, communicating can allow the aircraft to sink below the intended profile without triggering immediate alarm. And once below profile, recovery is not always simple. Another critical factor in these final moments is expectation bias. When pilots expect to see the ground at a certain point, the brain prepares for that visual transition. In fog, that transition doesn't happen. The brain then assumes the aircraft must still be higher than it is. Instruments say one thing. Expectation says another. That conflict delays correction. Investigators often find that in fog-related controlled flight into terrain, the aircraft is only a few seconds from safety when the first unmistakable warning arrives. By then, physics has already decided the outcome. Descent profiles collapse quickly at low altitude. There is no room to trade altitude for time. No space to arrest a sink rate once terrain proximity becomes critical. This is why fog accidents often show no aggressive last-second maneuvering. There is simply no time. The aircraft does not need to be diving. It only needs to be descending slightly more than intended. The most chilling truth is this: everything can be by the book until the book runs out of pages. In the final seconds, the crew likely believed they were seconds away from visual contact or a safe transition. Instead, the ground arrived first. Not because the aircraft failed. Not because training failed. But because perception lagged reality by just a few seconds. Fog doesn't cause dramatic errors. It causes late corrections. And at low altitude, late is the same as never. In the next part, we'll step back and ask the hardest question of all. Could this have been prevented earlier? We'll look at decision points before the approach, missed opportunities to break the chain, and why fog-related accidents almost always begin well before the aircraft reaches the ground. Because the crash didn't start in the fog. The fog just finished it. In aviation investigations, there is a phrase investigator use carefully but deliberately. The accident began before the approach. This crash fits that pattern exactly. By the time the aircraft was descending in heavy fog, options were already limited. The environment had narrowed margins so much that recovery required perfection. And perfection is not a safety strategy. So, investigators work backward, looking for off-ramps, moments earlier in the flight where a different choice could have preserved safety long before the fog became decisive. Off-ramp first, weather recognition versus weather acceptance. Fog rarely appears all at once, it builds. Visibility degrades in steps. Each step invites a choice: reassess, hold, divert, or continue. The most dangerous moment is not when visibility becomes unacceptable, it's when it becomes almost acceptable. At that point, the brain reframes risk as inconvenience. Continuing feels reasonable. Turning back feels excessive. That psychological shift is subtle, but it matters. Once a crew commits to an approach in deteriorating fog, every subsequent decision becomes harder to reverse. Off-ramp second, early go-around, or hold a go-around is not a failure. It's a margin reset. But go-arounds are hardest to execute before things feel urgent. When the aircraft still feels stable. When the approach still looks manageable. The instinct is to give it another moment. Fog punishes that instinct. Safest go-around is the one that happens before workload peaks, before instrument fixation sets in, before altitude margins shrink to seconds. Once below a certain height, the go-around option technically exists, but practically disappears. Off-ramp third, mission pressure. This was a medical flight. That matters. Medical missions carry an unspoken pressure to complete the task, not recklessness. Responsibility. Responsibility to patients, to teams waiting on the ground, to time itself. That pressure doesn't override procedures, but it does raise the internal bar for interruption. Decisions that would feel easy on a routine flight feel heavier here. Fog exploits that weight. The danger isn't that pilots ignore rules. It's that they stretch tolerances quietly, reasonably, until tolerances are gone. Off-ramp fourth, trusting data over expectation. Instrument approaches in fog demand absolute trust in numbers, not impression. The moment expectation and data disagree, data must win instantly. But humans don't switch instantly. We transition. That transition costs seconds. At low altitude, seconds are everything. Investigators often find that the aircraft was never wildly off profile, just slightly low, slightly fast, slightly late. In clear weather, those deviations are survivable. In fog, they compound invisibly. The core prevention truth: this crash was not prevented or caused by one decision. It was shaped by timing. Earlier conservatism would have felt inconvenient. Later correction became impossible. That's the paradox of fog-related accidents. The safer choice rarely feels urgent until it's too late. In the final part, we'll bring everything together: what this crash teaches about fog, human limits, and why visibility is not just about what pilots see, but about how early they choose to stop relying on sight at all. Because fog doesn't win by force, it wins by delay. When everything is stripped away: weather reports, flight paths, procedures, and timelines. The crash of the Mexican Navy medical flight near Galveston leaves behind one unavoidable truth. The fog did not overpower the aircraft. It overpowered time. Nothing about this accident suggests recklessness. Nothing suggests panic. Nothing suggests a lack of skill or training. Instead, it shows how perfectly reasonable decisions become fatal when visibility disappears faster than human perception can adjust. Heavy fog is not dangerous because pilots cannot fly in it. It is dangerous because it delays recognition. It delays the moment when the crew fully accepts that visual flying is over. It delays the moment when instruments must be trusted without hesitation. It delays the moment when continuation must give way to interruption. And in aviation, delay is often more dangerous than error. This crash was not caused by a single mistake. It was caused by timing. By the time the fog fully revealed itself as unmanageable, the aircraft was already too low, too committed, and too close to terrain for recovery. The approach still felt stable. The descent still felt controlled. The environment still felt familiar. But fog had already rewritten reality. That is why fog-related crashes are among the most tragic in aviation. They don't feel like emergencies until they are already irreversible. There is no dramatic escalation, just a quiet narrowing of options until none remain. The most important lesson here is not about weather minima or regulation. It is about human limits. Humans do not perceive altitude, speed, and closure accurately without visual reference. Instruments compensate for that, but only if they are trusted early and completely. Partial trust is not enough. Light trust is not enough. Another lesson is about mission pressure. Medical flights carry purpose, urgency, responsibility. Those qualities save lives every day, but in marginal weather, they can also delay interruption just long enough for fog to win. The final and most important lesson is this. The safest decision in fog is almost always the earliest one. Early diversion, early hold, early go around, early acceptance that sight is no longer reliable. None of those feel heroic. All of them feel inconvenient. But aviation safety is not built on heroics. It is built on humility, especially in weather that hides danger instead of announcing it. Fog doesn't need violence to be lethal. It only needs you to believe you still have time. This crash reminds us that visibility is not just about what pilots can see. It's about how soon they stop trusting their eyes. And once that lesson is learned, even at terrible cost, it becomes one of aviation's most important truths. In fog, survival belongs to the earliest decision, not the last correction.